since our minds are on it, Revolutionary Wars. And I can't go into the text without at least saying something about that. As you know, many years ago, a group of people, ever-growing disgruntled with a tyrannical king, an ocean away, bringing turmoil onto the people, led to a lot of the historic events that we see. When you have a king that is enforcing taxation, a massive burden on the people that is beyond what they can bear. There was many years ago a particular group of people that just could not handle the taxation anymore. They couldn't handle the vast differences between a king's religion, who was an ocean away, versus their own religious beliefs and practices. They couldn't handle the tyranny of the laws and the oppression that goes against their culture, against their way of life and their living. And it led to a group of men coming together and making the decision, a very hard decision, to engage in a revolutionary war. And that revolutionary war went on for a little over 7 years. And at the conclusion of those 7 years, the war ended in 73 AD with the destruction, loss, and failure of that Revolutionary War. And I'm not speaking of the American Revolutionary War. I'm speaking of the Jewish Revolutionary War, often referred to as the 66 AD Jewish Roman Revolt. It was a revolutionary war that took place in 66 AD and continued for 7 years. In 70 AD, we saw the collapse of the temple and the theocratic system of the Jewish people. In 73 at Masada, I've been to the top of the mountain there where the final stand of the Jewish people took place and the war comes to a conclusion. And if you look at what led up to the years leading up to the 70 of the Sanhedrin making the decision, there needs to be a time of separation. And now's the time. We need to separate from Rome. Rome is such a far away, the emperor is such a far away, these edicts and this tyranny and the Herods that rule over us, this is unsustainable. There needs to be revolution, there needs to be separation. Jesus had let us down. He didn't bring that. At least this was the mind of the Jewish people. We anticipated him overthrowing that government. We anticipated him bringing that revolution. It didn't happen. And so now it's incumbent upon us to overthrow that government and to separate ourselves. And if you look at some of the historic reasons, it sounds very similar to what our founding fathers were arguing themselves. History never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. And 1700 years later, in 1776, it wasn't 70 of the Sanhedrin making this decision, it was 56 leaders of the 13 colonies of Britain here in the United States, not the United States at the time, making the decision that this taxation without representation, this tyrannical government, you have these soldiers that are pouring in, you have all of this that's taking place. You have this separation of our religious beliefs. We don't want to function or work under the Church of England. Nothing aligns. And there needs to be a separation. And as is the case, most Independence Days, first thing I do every 4th of July is I get up and I grab my Constitution and I read through, which is usually in the front of it, the Declaration of Independence. Most people don't do that, but I'm a weird, person. And yesterday was Independence Day, and I need to refresh my mind. Independence of what? What was the argument? What was the fight? Why go to war? What was the rationale? And it's not an overly lengthy document. I thought about reading the entire thing, but for time's sake this morning, let me just read the first paragraph here by these 56, what I would consider courageous, brave men who they knew exactly what they were getting into. 9 of them, after signing their John Hancock, we could say, on this document, they knew it was a death sentence. 9 of them would die of battle wounds. 5 of them would become prisoners of war. 12 of them would have their homes burnt down, and 17 of them would lose all of their earthly possessions. And none of them changed their minds. They knew that what they were doing was important, and they knew why they were doing what they were doing. Listen to their argument. In the opening of this Declaration of Independence, it says, in Congress, July 4th, 1776, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separation and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it continues on, and much of the document is going to deal with the grievances that they have with King George III, and all of it was legitimate for the time. But I want you to draw your attention to a phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. That is the premise, the foundation, the basis, the purpose by which we're pursuing this. We are going to go to war. We are separating as a nation, and it's based off of nature and nature's God, which entitles us to such. That's the argument. But I suppose we should ask this morning, why then? Because the Jewish Revolutionary War, same arguments, in fact. Kind of the same scenario leading up. Why was that Revolutionary War non-successful and this Revolutionary War successful? And the answer is written in the document itself. The answer is one word. The word is providence. Providence. The Declaration of Independence ends with these words. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They understood, these 56 men coming together, that what they were about to engage in, it would be successful or it would fail on one condition: the providence of God. We are making a decision. We believe the decision is right. We are basing this decision on nature and nature's God. And if providence would be on our side, this will be a successful endeavor. Last night, our president, President Trump, gave his America's 250th birthday speech. And in that speech, he said these words: "Our destiny is written by God." Our destiny is written by God. Now, that's a very wise statement, whether he knew it or not. And it is very much in line with the heart and the mind and the thoughts of our founding fathers, and it's perfectly in line with Scripture as well. This nation goes nowhere without the sovereign hand of God, the purpose of God. And this is nothing new. I mean, this is we've known this forever. The prophet Daniel in Daniel 5 in verse number 21, speaking to another Gentile empire, another Gentile king, when he speaks to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, "The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses." Every king rise and falls, every kingdom rise and falls, every empire rise and falls according to God's providential sovereign plan. He is the one who determines the outcome because he has a plan, he has a purpose. We don't just end our political speeches here in this country by saying, God bless America, because it's a pleasant, easy way to end a speech. We end it because it is, in fact, a reality that we live every day. God has, in fact, blessed the decision of these 56 men. God has, in fact, blessed our nation for 250 years. God has, in fact, blessed us, who are fortunate enough to be born and raised in this country. God has blessed America, and God continues to bless America, and I pray that God will continue to bless America. But it's only because of the providential nature of God. He has, at this moment, and for the last 250 years, a purpose and a plan that He alone knows. And yes, we are blessed by God, and we may not even know why. The future is unknown to us, and the hand of God is unknown to us entirely. But we know this, what we have experienced is God's blessings because of His providence. Now, not all of our founding fathers would agree with that sentiment. I find it intriguing because the man who wrote the majority of the Declaration of Independence, even himself wouldn't agree with much of what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote it because there was kind of a split among the colonial leaders there, most of which were Protestants, but you have those who were leaders in this young formation of a country who were deists. And among those who were deists, you have James Monroe, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, just to mention a few of the well-known names. But the most well-known of them all, of the deists that began our country, is Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson wouldn't even have agreed with the words that he wrote of nature and nature's God has entitled us to such. It goes against the deist worldview. And so I find it interesting that he understands who he's writing to, he understands why he's writing, and he is appeasing to both sides of the aisle, where you have the conflict of these early leaders between the predominantly deist and those of the Protestant, because there's very few Catholic, who are kind of arguing and working together to formulate a country, even though their religious views have differences. And he includes that because he knows the audience to which he's speaking. But Thomas Jefferson himself is one of the most unique. I admire Thomas Jefferson. I disagree with Thomas Jefferson on many points, but I definitely look up to Thomas Jefferson, a brilliant, brilliant man who accomplished much in his life. And we owe a great deal of debt to Thomas Jefferson. In fact, yesterday was an important day in the remembrance of Thomas Jefferson as well, because not only did our country celebrate 250 years of existence, it also remembered the 200-year anniversary of the death of our third president, Thomas Jefferson, along with John Adams, our second president, both of which died on the 50th anniversary of our country in 1826. And so yesterday was an important day to remember Thomas Jefferson. But I want you to think about Thomas Jefferson in relation, I'm going somewhere with this, in relation to our text this morning. This is why I'm reading the Declaration of Independence. And it's why I'm bringing up Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence at the age of 33. Many, many years later in his life, he spends, after his retirement, and he had a very full life. If you think about Thomas Jefferson, he was our very first Secretary of State. He was our second Vice President. He goes on to be our third President. After his retirement, as if all of that wasn't enough, he goes on to found the University of Virginia. And he spends his entire life focusing on, botany and science and history, and so just an amazing person. But near the end of his life, he endeavors to give much of his retirement days to one particular project. And it is a project that we know today. In fact, if you go to the Smithsonian museum today, you can go and look at the original document that he I would say write. He read, but he put it together. It's called the Jefferson Bible. We refer to this as Jefferson Bible. The title of it was The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And Thomas Jefferson is famous for this work that he did. It was a private work, and he never intended for it to be publicly known because of its controversial nature. But many years after his death, it was published, and many people loved it and became followers of it. And you can read it. It's not a very big Bible. It's only 84 pages long. And in this Bible, it predominantly only focuses on the Gospels. Thomas Jefferson, and you can see this clearly as you read the Declaration of Independence, he is a product of his time. He is a product of the generation that preceded him. Really the several generations that preceded him, but leading up to him in the 1700s, he is a product of the Age of Enlightenment, or you could refer to it as the Age of Reason. And you see a lot of the Enlightenment reason philosophy written in our documents, which is not necessarily evil or wrong in itself, but it's what led to the formation of our country. But it's also what led to him denying anything as a deist, as one who is a product of the Age of Enlightenment, that if you're going to read the Bible and you're going to be one who relies purely on reason, you got to get rid of the supernatural. And you don't want to get rid of the New Testament because you really like Jesus. Jesus had a lot of great things to say. Jesus was a moral leader. Jesus has a lot to teach us. And so I don't exaggerate when I say this. He literally took 4 Bibles. He took a French Bible, a Latin Bible. He took a Greek Bible and an English Bible. He took, not figuratively, literally, a pair of scissors, and he cut out of those Bibles every portion that he didn't like, and he pasted the portions that he liked in a chronological order on blank pages, forming the 84-page Jefferson Bible. And you say, well, what did he cut out? What did he leave out? Well, what he left out was the story of the walking on water of Jesus. He left out the healing of the sick. He left out the feeding of the multitudes. He left out the raising of the dead. He left out the virgin birth. He left out the resurrection. He left out the claims that Jesus is God. He left out angels. He left out fulfilled prophecies. And he left out anything that revealed supernatural powers. And really what Thomas Jefferson wanted to present was a Jesus who presented philosophy and moral guidance. Now, why am I bringing that up? Because that's not a pleasurable part of our past history. I bring it up because it was Thomas Jefferson himself at the age of 33 who wrote those words in our Declaration of Independence. The laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Or in other words, we are entitled to do what we're about to do because of nature and nature's God. And we need to answer a question this morning. Who is nature's God? If you're going to say that we have a right to bring about such a declaration that led to the death of many, that led to the separation of countries, that brought about this glorious, wonderful experiment that we've been privileged to be part of for 250 years. If you ask the question, what was the foundation, the bedrock, the reasoning for that endeavor? It is because of nature and nature's God. Which God? Because there's a lot of people today that like to argue whether they didn't believe in the God of the Bible, and it wasn't the God of the Bible that was being talked about. Who is nature's God? And the answer to that question is going to be in our text this morning. It's in Mark chapter number 6. And beginning in verse number 45, we see the story most commonly known as the story where Jesus walks on water. And most people just will casually read through these verses and they'll say, man, it's interesting. Jesus walked on water. How cool is that? And they'll not really catch all that's there. And certainly this morning, we're not going to be able to catch all that's there because this is a very meaty section of Scripture here. It has layers. And you see this in many, many places in the Bible, where there's the surface layer, which is usually the narrative story. And usually the narrative story includes some type of a moral lesson or big point or big idea to glean from it. But there's always layers underneath, and there can be theological layers, and there's certainly a theological layer about God, who God is, the nature of God. There is a soteriological layer here, the understanding of salvation. How does salvation work versus works and faith and so forth. There is an eschatological layer in this story as well. There are undertones and shadows of future events to come in this story, just kind of tucked away in there. There's layers. And if I were to really unpack all of that, I could preach probably for weeks this one story of Jesus walking on the water, and it would be an entirely different sermon each week without ever manipulating or twisting the text, but just simply going a little bit deeper than the previous week to draw out nuances that aren't always easily seen. But for this morning, I want to just look at the general understanding, the general application. And as I've told you before, in Mark's gospel, if you really want to get to what is the big point when you're reading a story, what are you trying to get to, Mark? Why are you presenting this? A cheat code to that is go to the end and read the last verse. Because typically Mark will tell you why he's telling you this in the last phrase as he's finishing. We'll get to that momentarily. But if you look at verse number 45, it begins with these words. Immediately, here's the emphasis on a hurry. Mark uses this. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. If you weren't here, the background here is Jesus is tired. His disciples are tired. They haven't slept in days. They haven't eaten in days. The disciples at this point, maybe they've eaten, Jesus hasn't. He's been too busy feeding upwards to 25, maybe potentially 30,000 people, miraculously. It's the largest on a scale miracle that Jesus ever did in his earthly ministry. And it's taken him all day to do this. The evening has come. It's now nighttime. And if you read John's account, John tells us that at the conclusion of Jesus feeding the masses, that the rumbling among the crowd is that this is the Messiah, this is the anointed one, this is the prophet that Moses spoke of. Let's crown him as king and take him to Jerusalem. And so that's spreading rapidly throughout this massive crowd, and Jesus knows that if we don't get out of here soon, by force, they are going to come and take me and bring me to Jerusalem and force me to be king. And it's not time for him to be king. This is not time for him to rule on earth. This is the time for him to become the sacrifice. And so he knows that that's about to happen. And so he takes his disciples very quickly and he tells them, get into the boat, go towards Bethsaida. Go that direction. He doesn't give them a specific location, because if you combine the four Gospels together, you get a sense that he's not giving them the direction of directly where to go. And I think the reason is this. It's because he knows the crowd is listening. So he just says, get in the boat, go that way. Go that direction. Don't let anybody know where you're going. And so he makes them. This is a demand, a command. It's a forceful, do it now. And you have to know that for the disciples, this is a very confusing moment for them. No doubt they have heard the crowd. We want to make him king, which is exactly what the disciples have been waiting for. In fact, in their minds, they've been thinking, why is this taking so long? How is it that people are not coming to the conclusion fast enough? This is our new king. This is our new king. We're going to be sitting with him. We have thrones with him. We're going to rule. The kingdom is now here. We've been going around preaching. What we've been preaching? The kingdom of heaven is here. That's what they've been preaching. They want him to be king. They want the crown to be placed on his head, and they want thrones to be given to them as quickly as possible. This is the moment. This is the time. Take advantage of this. This is a big enough crowd to forcefully go down to Jerusalem and make the elites submit to us. Instead, Jesus is saying, no. Get in the boat. We got to get away. That's counterintuitive. And the Bible doesn't say that they argue, though. So I'm going to assume that they don't. Instead, they are submissive. They are obedient. They are presumably just doing exactly as he says for them to do, even though they don't understand why or see the help in it. And so they get in a boat and they leave. Well, if you look at verse number 46, it says, and when he had sent them away, that's the crowd. So Jesus alone goes out to the crowd and says, it's late, go home, I fed you, you have food. Go home now, go back to your places. He sends them away. And what does he do? Well, he goes up on a mountain, it says, and he prays. That's so typical Jesus, isn't it? Fatigued, tired, weary, and even at this point, starving Jesus. What is the necessity of his focus? What is it that he feels, I don't have time for anything else, but I need to pray. He prays. So he's up on the mountain, which is a cliffside. He's up on this cliffside, this mountainside. He's praying, and we know that he prays the whole night. This is not a short little prayer. How do I know that? Well, verse number 47 says, now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea. So they have now gone several miles into the Sea of Galilee. And he was alone on the land. And then it says, then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them, now about the fourth watch of the night. So that gives us a timestamp here. We knew it was nighttime, but now we know what time at night is. This is the fourth watch, and the Romans have 4 watches at night. And this is the last of the 4, and it goes from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So here's Jesus. He has been up on the mountain. He has been praying throughout the night, and it's now sometime after 3 a.m. And what it says here in verse number 48 is that he saw them straining at rowing. In case you didn't know, that's the first miracle in this story. In fact, there's multiple miracles in this story, but that's the first one. He didn't have light pollution like we have today. It's pitch dark. It's the middle of the night. It is roughly 3 a.m. They are miles out to sea. You cannot see them physically. That's just not possible. And yet here he is praying, and in his prayer, in his state of communing with the Father, while he is praying, he sees them. He sees them straining. And the word there in English is straining, but the Greek word has more of the idea of they're tormented. It's usually translated torment in other places. They're tormented. Now think about this for a moment. They're already fatigued. They're already tired. Once again, they've gone days without sleep. They're just go, go, go. And here they are. They're trying to get to the other side. And what's going on? Well, verse 47, or verse 48 rather, tells us that they're straining, they're tormented at rowing. Why? Because of this wind that is against them. Here they are on the lake again, just like in chapter 4. And they're in the middle of this storm that is pushing down on. The locals refer to this storm as the Sharkia. In English, the shark. That was the local term for these massive storms that come in. So they're in the middle of this massive storm, the Sharkia, the shark, and it's biting down on them, and they're struggling along. And they left in the evening as the sun was setting. And all they've been doing now for hours, this is another reason why, at the end of the feeding of the 5,000, there was 12 baskets of food left over, and those 12 baskets went to the disciples. Jesus knew that they needed a lot of energy. He was like, eat up, boys, stuff your mouths, because you got a long night ahead of you. So, you get fed up, get that energy, because you're going to be paddling really hard for hours. Have you ever been on a lake? I've paddled the Columbia River before, and if you're going upstream or anywhere, it can be a challenge. Particularly if the wind is going against you. And you're just paddling and paddling and paddling. You're either not moving or you're moving backwards, even though you're giving it your all. And most of us can only do that for a short period of time. But here's the disciples. They've been going for hours. And it's dark. They can't see where they're going. They can't see what's going on. All they know is the wind is blowing them and forcing down on them, and they're just paddling, and they're paddling, and they're paddling. And no doubt, after 5+ hours, because that's what it represents here, after 5+ hours of paddling and getting nowhere, They have to be physically at the end of their abilities. This is why the Greek word tormented, they're tormented at this point. And so, well, what verse 48 tells us that at the end of that, at the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. When they reached the end of their abilities, Jesus came to them. Even though he was several miles away, he saw them, and he comes walking to them. Now, picture that if you can. The wind's blowing, the waves are rocking back and forth all over the place. Jesus comes down the mountain. Jesus steps onto the water, and he walks on it as if he's taking a stroll through the park. And it has no effect on him. And that's what verse 48 tells us, that he came to them walking on the sea. That's miracle number 2 right there. Walking on the sea. Now, Thomas Jefferson grew up in a time reading literature that came out of the 1600s and early 1700s. And much of the literature of that day and age would argue, I've read some of it, would argue that what was transpiring in this story was at different times of the year, potentially what was going on here was that you have Jesus who found a sandbar. And he's walking on this sandbar that goes along the same direction that the disciples were going. And then others during the time of reason were reading this and saying, no, this was at that time of night, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. This is the time that large fog would come in. And he's literally just walking along the shoreline. And the disciples, they just see him on the shoreline and he's covered by fog. But it appears that he's walking on water, and it scared them and kind of gave a ghostly appearance. And so forth and so on the arguments go. In fact, if you don't believe the Bible and if you don't read the Bible literally, you're going to come up with any argument you can, no matter how ridiculous they are. But once again, what does the text say? It says that he was walking on the sea, not on a sandbar, not on a fog-covered shoreline. He's walking on the water. Otherwise, the whole story has no value. It has no point. It has no purpose if there's not a real miracle going on here. And not only that, it defies the whole point that Jesus is trying to get across. It says that he's walking on the sea and would have passed them by. Now, unfortunately, the New King James words it that way, and it's not wrong, but it's a little misleading in how it's worded there. Thelo is the Greek word for would here. It simply means this: he intended to go by them. What it's revealing, the word would there, is that this is what his will was. He willed to walk by them. He wanted to walk by them. He needed to walk by them. Otherwise, fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies could not be fulfilled. The question people fail to ask is this. No one ever seems to ask the right question when reading these miraculous stories. Why walk on water? He could have done something else. He could have gotten a boat. He could have transported himself right into their boat. He could have transported himself to the other side where eventually he'd meet them. Why walk on the water? Because there's a point that he's trying to tell them. There's a message that needs to get across that they're not learning. They're not getting. Job chapter 9 and verse number 8 says this: He, speaking of God, He alone spreads out the heavens. He treads on the waters of the sea. If he goes by me, I do not see him. If he moves past, I do not perceive him. Job is telling his audience that only God can walk on the water. Only God is the one who spread out the sea. Only God is the one who controls the great deeps. And so, if he passes by me and I don't see him, it's not his fault, it's my fault, is what Job is saying. In Psalm 77 and verse number 19, the psalmist says, Your way was in the sea, your path in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. There's many other such passages like this in the Old Testament. You can read it in the Psalms and Isaiah. I'll take you to another one in a moment. A very important one. But the point is this. Jesus is walking on this water with a message to send to them. Because earlier, if you think back to chapter number 4, at the conclusion of that story of the storm that took place in chapter number 4, they asked a very simple question. They asked the question, who can, in fact, go to chapter 4, you're in chapter 5 or 6, go back 2 chapters. Chapter 4, verse number 39 says this, "Then he arose, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." Now, the way that's worded in the original is it was immediate. So he speaks, and it wasn't a slow down. It didn't slowly calm. It just, boom, it's calm. So he did that. The response of the disciples in verse 40, or Jesus says in verse number 40, "But he said to them, 'Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?'" He's addressing the main problem right now. Where is your faith? Do you not know who I am? Do you not trust me? Can you not depend on me? Are you not relying on me? Where is your faith at? Notice their response, verse 41. "And they feared." It's an interesting response. "They feared exceedingly and said to one another, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the seas obey him?'" They sound more like deists at this point. It's like, who is this? The seas obey him. The waters just ceased. The storm went away. And they're asking the most important question that anybody could ever ask. Who is this? Who is this? And when we read one of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the basis upon which we formed our nation, the basis upon which we decided to declare war on Great Britain, the basis upon which we decided we need to be our own governing nation was because of nature and nature's God. Who is nature's God? Who is this individual? Who is this person? And if you've read the New Testament, you know the answer. Because John chapter number 1 tells us that Jesus is the one who created nature. Colossians chapter 1 tells us that Jesus is the one who created nature. Hebrews chapter number 1 tells us that Jesus is the one who created nature. And when you read the 4 Gospels, there's only one person in the 4 Gospels who is controlling nature. It's Jesus. And they're asking the question, who is this? Who can do these things? We see nature and we see the power of nature. And by the way, they have been rowing all night long against nature. They have been trying to beat nature. They have been trying to overpower nature. They have been trying to be better than nature. But they have failed, just as I told you, there's multiple layers here. There's a soteriological layer here. The nature in this story represents good works and sin and our natural fallen state. And you can row as much as you want against it through good works. You can try to overpower it. You can try to be good. You can try to be righteous. You will fail. You will always revert back to your natural state, and you will never be able to beat the nature, the depraved nature you were born with. There's only one person that has power over the physical nature and your spiritual nature. That's Jesus. And so Jesus comes out, walking on the water. They've already asked the question just a day or two before, who can do this? But for whatever reason, they didn't come to the right answer. They didn't immediately go, he's God. And while they sat on the hillside and they watched the thousands being fed by Jesus, they didn't go, he's God. They failed to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And so they failed the lesson of chapter number 4. And so in chapter number 6, Jesus is repeating the test. The test is getting repeated again. And this time he is doing it in such a way to where there's no doubt as to who this is. It says in verse number 51, "Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased." That's miracle number 3, by the way. The wind ceased. This time he didn't rebuke it. This time he didn't say anything. He doesn't need to. He's already done this just the day earlier. And so now this time he's getting in the boat and just calm again. Perfectly calm. And even more so this time, because the other gospel accounts tells us that he gets into the boat, the sea becomes perfectly calm, and they are immediately transported to the other side, to the location they're supposed to be at. They're not even in the middle of the lake anymore. They're immediately, that's another miracle, by the way. There's lots of miracles in the story. They're immediately transported there. So this time, are they going to sit in the boat, look at Jesus with great fear and trembling, and are they going to ask the question again, who is this? Who can this be? Well, look at verse 51. It says, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. Instead of fear this time, there's amazement and marvel. Now, Mark tells us what the problem was. He says in verse 52, For, that's the point of the story, for they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. They saw everything. They saw the truth. They saw the reality of who Jesus was. They saw what Jesus did that only God can do. But their hearts were hardened, and because their hearts were hardened, their eyes were blinded, and they could not see who was in the boat with them. They were asking the question, who could this be? But not coming to the conclusion, this could only be one person. This could become God. Now, thankfully, spoiler alert, we haven't got to the end of the Gospels. They do figure that out eventually. You are the Son of God, Peter declares. That's who you are. There's nowhere else for us to go. We see it. We understand it. But even after 2 years of traveling with Jesus, there's still a little bit of a struggle for them to see their hearts are still hardened. That'll be short-lived. And the other gospel accounts tells us a little bit about what they learned from this. Peter gets out of the boat and walks to Jesus. And that's not recorded in Mark's account, by the way. If you remember early on, Mark's account was written by young John Mark, who was a disciple of Peter. And he was writing down the memoirs of Peter. And Peter probably didn't want to include his failure of sinking into the sea. And so that's why it's not in Mark's account, because that kind of looks bad. And you're like, well, let's just not talk about that. That's not really the point, is it? It's like, let's focus on the point here. And so that's recorded in the other gospel accounts, but not in Mark's account here. Verse 53 says this, when they get to shore, it says, and when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. And when they had come out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him, ran through the whole surrounding region and began to carry on beds those who were sick to everywhere they heard he was. Verse 56, wherever he entered into villages, cities of the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And as many as had touched the hem, or many as had touched him, were made well. This was a lesson that Jesus had taught his disciples. I hope they had. We'll continue to read. We'll see it next week in chapter 7. But he immediately begins ministry again. No quick nap, no quick meal, no sneak away to some place in the woods to get some sleep. If you're reading the Gospel of Mark, you're at a point now where you're just following the day-by-day activities of Jesus. Like, did the man sleep at all? Did he ever eat? Like, when is he going to get a break? It's just go, go, go. Well, he did that for you and me. He emptied himself. He emptied all of himself. Jesus left nothing on the line. He didn't hold back anything. He had a short period of time here on this earth, and he gave everything, every second he gave, until he gave all on the cross. Well, I'm out of time, so I want you to see a passage with me. Go to the Old Testament. Go to Psalms, and look at Psalm 107. Psalm 107. And I want you to see a connection between the story that we just read and what the psalmist in Psalm 107 had to say. Because if you're asking the question, when the declaration presents that we made a decision and based it off of nature and nature's God, and the disciples are asking the question, who can control nature? Who can tell nature what to do other than God? So who is this man that we're talking about? Well, in Psalm 107, verse number 19 says this, "Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them out of their distresses. He sent his word and healed them and delivered them from their destructions. Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. Let them sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving and declare his works with rejoicing. Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commands and raises the stormy wind, which lifts up the waves of the sea. They mount up to the heavens. They go down to the depths. Their soul melts because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man. And at their wits' end, then they cry out to the Lord in their trouble." You remember Peter crying out, "Lord, save me," as he's sinking? And he brings them out of their distresses. He calms the storm so that its waves are still. Then they are glad because they are quiet, so he guides them to their desired haven. Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. Let them exalt him also in the assembly of the people and praise him in the company of the elders. What did Jesus most want from his disciples? That they would acknowledge that nature and nature's God, that he is nature's God, that he created nature, that he controls nature, that he is God. And if they would only acknowledge that he is God, they would worship him. They would praise him. They would exalt him. And all their troubles would be removed. That's what Jesus wanted for his disciples. And the best way to get that accomplished was to do something that is impossible for man to do and only capable for God to do, but it had to be something that would draw their minds back to the Old Testament passages that speak only of God. And so when our founding fathers said that we made the decision that we made off of nature and nature's God, who is nature's God? Jesus. Jesus is God. Jesus created nature. Jesus controls nature. And Jesus does what he does with nature because he wants us to see him. He wants us to acknowledge him. He wants us to worship him. That's the conclusion. In fact, everything God does is for that ultimate purpose, that he would be high and lifted up, that he would be glorified, that he would be worshiped. And often he has to do things that are troubling. Often he has to bring us through storms. Often he also has to bring hardships into our life in order for our eyes to be open to that, to see and to acknowledge him for who he is. And so he had, at this particular time, he had to become the man who walks on water so that they would see that he wasn't just a mere man. He was God, and they will worship him.